Welcome, all our listeners. We are here today with LSR Press and author um, Alden Sproull to discuss a new work of poetry, your first, I believe,
Yes.
entitled Walking Along the Edge. Um, this is a very intimate and thoughtful collection of works that deal with or come from your experiences working very closely with cancer patients as a chaplain, clinical chaplain, and a spiritual director. Um, we want to welcome you here today. We're very honored to have you here speaking with
Thank
us.
you.
Thank you so much. Um, just as a starting off point, I wanted to ask you how you got into this work of working closely with with people who are going through just very difficult times, and what led you to that?
Well, after clinical training years and years ago now, um, I sent my resume to Lutheran General Healthcare System in Chicago, and they had a position open in cancer care. And they were intrigued with my background and interests. And eventually, after flying to Chicago and doing interviews, they hired me. And that began my first 8-year immersion in cancer care. I worked with primarily older teens and adults in that unit. Every once in a while, I would be asked to go to the pediatric service and work with families there with children. And that began one of the most exciting, challenging, lifelong journeys that you could ever have. You learn very quickly that you really don't know a lot, and that the best gift you can give to patients and families is listening.
I was really struck by one of the lines in one of the poems that you say, listening is a sacred act which lifts the spirit of the one speaking. I
Yes,
so it's very poignant, very true.
yes.
Um, but when you started, have you always been writing? How did that enter into the process of your work?
Well, I've been writing for a long time, publishing articles and that kind of thing. But the movement with cancer patients and poetry began uh, as I would be called back to the hospital to deal with a crisis situation with one of those families. And many of them were tragedies in those days because the early development of cancer care was more about preparing you for death than giving you an extension of life that we do today.
Mhm.
And walking home, I began to hear these words begin to rumble in my heart and life. And I would go home and rush into my study and copy them down in a first draft, and then work on them over the next months and try to sharpen them into something of meaning and purpose. And if families were present, I would often share the poetry with them, and they were deeply moved and ask often, you ought to really publish these and get them out for others to read. And I had no preconceived idea as to their value at that point. And it was only when I met Katya that things began to change.
Okay, thank you. Well,
But one of the things that I discovered was that these poems became a heart's ease, which allowed me to keep on going. There was some kind of inner transformation and healing that was going on so that I could make the next step into the unknown with them.
so it's very much a part of your process in your work.
Yes,
And you talk about in the very beginning in your author's notes of the book, you invite the reader to interact with the poems,
yes,
not just emotionally, but also tangibly. through written response and through reflection and discovery. How did that process evolve with your patients as you continue to work on and write and
Mhm. Well, the first encounter I recall very clearly was with a professor, woman, history professor. She was dying of cancer and had never written a piece of poetry in her life. And I encouraged that maybe we give that some consideration. And she began to, argue with me. Well, I can't do that kind of stuff. It's beyond my ability. I'm a lecturer and I don't write very much. And I said, well, write down 25 words that speak to where you find yourself today. And let's try to then massage them and put them into form. And she worked for about 15 or 20 minutes. I'm sitting there in silence. And she said, I think I have something here. I said, well, why don't you read it out loud? And as she read it out loud, the dynamic shifted in her heart and life, began to weep and to express deeper emotions than she had given herself permission to do before. And she then began to say, maybe I need to sit with this and do some reflection and writing. And I'm pretty gullible. I believed what she said was important and began to encourage others to do so.
absolutely.
And do that myself.
There's something I really want to spend some time talking about silence, which you just brought up. But before that, to address what you just said, um, the power of giving someone permission to allow their thoughts to have a space on on the page, but that transition between from the page to breath, to giving it breath,
Yes.
and then beyond the breath is your presence there as witness, as listener.
See, the
But
contemplation is rooted in people coming in with all kind of agenda.
Mhm.
I'm going to
Mhm.
do this. I want to do this. I want to handle this, work this,
Mhm.
touch here, touch you there. And I decided a long time ago that I would just be with them and not assume a posture of knowledge unless asked. And that worked wonders in my world.
Yeah. Uh, Silence. It's a theme throughout the book. It's in my observations, or as I was reading it, in the first section, celebrating the written word, you talk about writing and you talk about silence as tough. That especially, I would think, when dealing with an illness,
Mm-hmm.
that unknown, that um, all the possibilities running through one's head, they can be
Yes.
cacophonous, because and loud in that silence. You almost want to fill the unknown void. But then
Yeah.
in the second section, scratching lines, there's this different relationship that you have as you talk about silence as a powerful medium towards peace, towards um, being with oneself, understanding oneself and the divine. Could you speak to silence and talk about your relationship to it? I know you've done a lot of work with retreats, and I just would love to hear more about that.
Well, along the journey, about a year and a half into my experience at Lutheran General, Daniel, our son at 11 and a half, was diagnosed with osteogenic sarcoma. And an experience that I wouldn't wish on any parent, but it was tough. Flo Smith, the Roman Catholic coordinator of ministry there, we had 30 chaplains on staff. It was the mecca of pastoral care in the country. She came by after Dan's diagnosis and surgery, and he'd begun chemotherapy. And she said, Al, do you know anything about silence? And I said, very, very little, Flo. And she said, I would encourage you to find a way to step aside into some silence so that you can experience more deeply and more openly what you've been going through. And I was frightened by it. What will I discover about myself in a very vulnerable time? And I finally got up enough courage to go to the first silent experience at the Shalem Institute of Spiritual Formation in Washington, D.C. And I was with 30 others for 40 hours in silence. And the first 12 hours of that silence, I thought I was going to explode, Jennifer. I wasn't sure I'd be able to continue. And then there was such a sense of peace that came into that 12th hour that I began to just rest in that space. And the work that began then, I'm still reaping from today.
Wow.
I've built on that experience by doing 39 other experiences of 8 to 15 days of silence over the years, and found that the call of the patient to silence by me was clearly a call to move into the silence of my own journey. And someone asked me years ago, why do you do this? What's the benefit of this? And I thought a few moments and I said this to them: I would hate to think about the person I might have become had I not entered the arena to be still and to be silent. There's so much healing that comes out of that place, particularly focused on cancer care. When you hold a child dying, or you're holding a couple as they're facing the death of a daughter, those deep cutting edges impact your own life. And silence was the place that I could go, and as those wounds surfaced, lift them up as an offering for healing and hope. And that then empowered me to be able to go back and continue the work that I did for many, many years. It was a love romance with what I was doing.
Yes. I think that the poetry lends itself to this, to silence, because
Yeah.
the space is between words, because you scale down, you kind of take away all the busy
Yes.
background noise,
Mm-hmm.
and you also put it out there, and people, there's, in silence, I think there's a room for interpretation. So these poems
Mm-hmm.
are I think a wonderful vessel for what you've been working on. With that, is there a poem that you might read that kind of would capture this idea, or that speaks to you, that you'd like to share? Or more than one? I mean, we'd just love to hear your breath in these words.
There's the one that I wrote called Quiet Contemplation. Stillness is no escape. It's an immersion into life's fullest reality. Stillness moves toward openness. Quiet nurtures us into an abiding intimacy with ourselves, knowing self needs love first. Quiet moves us beyond ourselves into the mystery of wonder, giving space for healing. This one is called, titled Silence is Tough. Silence can be deafening, as two people sit across the room, not knowing how to respond to the clamoring noises, bombarding each other's minds. It distances them from the chaos of hurt, the deep sadness consuming their lives, caught by the trap of missed opportunities, which may have led to greater love. Does talk have any real hope toward healing? Walls are thick. Fear has driven them apart. Will they give passion permission to rise? Can they risk fresh air to heal their brokenness. This was a very, very painful story unfolding. I don't know whether you would want to go into the story behind the poem.
You are welcome to share it if you'd like.
The wife involved in this situation, early 40s, diagnosed with ovarian cancer with a metastatic disease already, advanced illness. And husband, over the months of treatment, ends up having an affair. And the wife is aware of what's been going on, as women most often do know what's happening to us. And this poem spoke then to what I was sensing and feeling in that initial encounter as we were trying to process her pain and his guilt. And this was a poem that I brought back to the next session.
Yes.
And we began to work with looking at it through the eyes of this poem. And a tough journey, but helpful.
Because life is messy
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
in many ways. There's a lot of questions that you pose in your poems, which I love, because it's not just here are my observations and what
Yes.
I've learned in all of my years. But those questions are then, and it sounds like in the work that you do with your patients as you bring these poems to them, are also invitations
Yeah.
to start a dialogue with oneself or with, you know,
Mhm.
something greater than that. As the reader, as I was reading them, I wrote all these questions down as I was reading that I wanted to
You remember in
reflect on.
turn of the 18th, 19th century, Rainier Marie Rilke wrote a piece of poetry that addresses the question issue, where he says that, in essence, what he's saying is that my hope for you would be that you would live into the questions long enough in hopes that maybe at some point in time down through your life, you'd be able to discover an answer or two.
Yeah.
That said to me that there was great value in not having an answer, but in just setting with the questions.
Yes.
And, you know, those of us with theological orientations often want to give the answer. And early on, when I was pastoring in Pennsylvania, I discovered that answers didn't cut it. Answers really didn't make the movement necessary for healing.
Yeah. And with the subject matter, with life and death and illness, there are so many questions. So far, I've been fortunate to not have a serious illness touch me directly, either in the people I know or myself, but we all walk along the edge in a way, because our
Yes.
lives are finite.
Yes.
And confronting those questions, allowing those questions to exist, I think is a healthy part of the process. So.
One of the patients said to me years ago that their discovery in the silence was that the silence is that of things that they could speak, that they discovered, but chose not to because they perceived them initially to be too painful for family to hear. The work that we were able to participate with them in gave them a sense of empowerment to trust that if those words were there, they needed to have some form of expression. And my theological belief is simply that God is discoverable in our lived human experiences. So as you move around, opening up spaces for those experiences to be shared, a greater sense of compassion and love is felt by the person.
That's beautiful. Hmm. We've talked about the first section a little bit of the book, celebrating the written word, where you talk about your joy of writing, um, and words as expression and groundingness. And then the second section a little bit, which is entitled "Scratching Lines," which there's more of kind of, you delve deeper into this idea of silence. Um, and then the last section, to me, if you could speak to it, something greater, I felt had a lot of personal anecdotes. There was more. There's quite a few cases that you seem to refer to, um, and it was a very honest and frank addressing of death. Like we've come through the book, and I don't know if how you feel people should approach the book from cover to cover, or if it's something that people can kind of turn to a page and contemplate that particular line or complete poem. But if you do read the book cover to cover, there is this journey in it
Yes.
that comes through to me, in the last section. So if you might speak to the last section a little bit, pardon me, this letting go and the experiences with family and with youth, and there's so much going on. Um,
Well, the challenge of living with cancer and recognizing the vulnerability of that illness. It's one of those diseases that doesn't give you the option to not address uh, end of life concerns. Um, Most of the people that I worked with in cancer care reflect that period of time when there wasn't much hope given. And some individuals chose not to respond to that sense of call to address those issues. My observed experience is that they died not very peaceful. They died deeply troubled because there was so much bubbling up for attention that they chose not to deal with. And when you push all of those things down inside yourself, you have to assign living energy to hold all of that in. And that for me was always too high a price to pay.
mhm.
Those patients who were able to sit down in the patient's room, and I would come in much as you have come into my life today and say that, we're here to talk about this movement together. And, uh, I would say that your loved one wishes us to talk about these issues. And we would begin that journey. And often there would be along the way deep expressions of love as apologies were made, almost a sense of joy as deep pain had been finally addressed and tended to in some way. Um, it's an important subject that when you look down through the history of spirituality, you find that the mystics, particularly the women mystics, talk about that by the time you're hitting midlife, if you get that far during those days, you must begin to look at and recognize that your life is going to end soon. And in order to do that well, you need to reflect on what it means for you to die. And for myself, I build that into my spiritual practice every Holy Week. What in me has to die in order that new life can come. And that's a very important piece of work for me every year. For something new is always discovered about letting go.
Mhm. And I feel like that idea, that exploration is, you capture that in your poems in this work of walking along the edge. Um, without putting a label on it. You invite others to take that walk as well, whether they're experiencing an illness or the ally or the witness or the family member of someone experiencing an illness. It goes beyond that, and it's an invitation. This book to me is an invitation,
Yeah.
in many ways.
Well, as I wrote the material and began to see the connectedness, it began to maybe at that point take on a broader application in light of the fact that we're dealing with so much death in our society these days. Maybe this could speak to some of that pain in some way. At least that would be my hope.
Is there a poem or two that you would like to share or might share with us as we say goodbye? Or anything else you would like to say?
Maybe grace in chaos. Havoc breeds this frenetic activity looming high over our heads with the price of disconnect from God and others, pushing us away from commitment. Not nurturing self in spirit increases our sense of helplessness. Overwhelmed by personal choices, withdrawing into anger, feeling stuck, with depression gripping my life, I turn into the dark mystery. My heart opens to sacred space, feeling pushed into the stillness, discovering an unfamiliar experience of love and affirmation. The gift of a word read speaks directly into my heart with healing and hope of return.
Thank you. Thank you so much for taking the time today to speak with me about your book. Once again, we are here talking about Walking Along the Edge with Alden Sproull. I highly recommend getting a copy of these poems. It's full of thoughtfulness and humility, acknowledging that illness and death, our mortality, goes beyond academics and
Yes.
pathology, and really involves embracing the unknown in the space that silence can hold for us. And that if we can engage in these, which these poems really are a wonderful testament to, we can learn so much about ourselves, and it helps us along the way. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Jessica. And as sort of a personal PS, thank you very much for honoring me with your willingness to walk in this journey with me. And I noticed that the poetry and the discussion touched your heart as well. If you wish to continue that conversation, all you have to do is ask.
Thank you.
Thank you.